David notices his loyal housekeeper of over 20 years sneaking out his penthouse with heavy, mysterious bags every night. He suspects the worst. Expecting to catch a thief, David follows her into the outer zone, the very neighborhood he is scheduled to demolish. But what he finds in a dimly lit basement isn't his missing silver or watches. It's a secret life of sacrifice. Hello, it's your favorite Bestie. I'm here again with another juicy story of kindness, sacrifice, and humanity. But before we continue, please smash that like button, subscribe, and share with your loved ones, as this helps us grow and bring you more exciting stories. Thank you. Now, grab a glass of chilled drink. Let's dive in. David Vane was a man of numbers. He didn't become a billionaire by guessing or taking risks he hadn't calculated first. He liked patterns. He liked when things made sense. In his world, if something was out of place, it meant there was a problem that needed to be solved. For 34 years, Sarah had been the most consistent part of his life. She was there when he woke up and there before he went to sleep. She had raised him after his mother passed away, making sure his clothes were pressed and his heart was tucked in. To David, Sarah was just part of the house. He never asked about her life or where she went at night. She was just Sarah. She was always there, quiet and faithful. But lately, the math was changing. It started 3 weeks ago. David noticed Sarah leaving at exactly 6 o'clock. That wasn't the strange part. The strange part were the bags. 2 large, heavy bags in each hand. David watched her from his desk as she moved toward the elevator. He knew for a fact she hadn't brought those bags with her in the morning. At first, he tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just laundry or old clothes he didn't need anymore. But then it happened again on Tuesday, then Thursday, then Monday. The bags were always full. They were so heavy, they made her shoulders lean and her pace slow. David's mind started to do what it did best. Look for the leak. He went through his house like he was performing an audit. He checked the kitchen. He checked the storage rooms. He even opened his safe to count his watches and his cash. Everything was exactly where it should be. Not a single thing was missing. This bothered him more than a simple theft would have. If she wasn't taking his things, what was she taking? And more importantly, why was she being so secretive about it? He realized then that he knew nothing about her. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know if she had a family or a home of her own. He had spent his whole life looking at her, but he had never actually seen her. He felt a small spark of something like guilt, but he pushed it down. He needed facts, not feelings. He sat in his chair, staring at the door she had just walked through. The house felt too quiet, almost empty. He couldn't stand the idea of an unsolved mystery under his own roof. He didn't think Sarah was a thief, but the bags didn't lie. He stood up and grabbed his keys. He didn't take his usual car or wear his expensive watch. He wanted to be a ghost. He waited 5 minutes, then headed for the elevator. Tonight, the man who built an empire by knowing every detail was going to find out the one thing he had missed. He was going to follow Sarah and see exactly what she was hiding in those bags. David kept his distance. He sat in his car, watching Sarah walk toward the bus stop. She moved with a struggle, the weight of those bags pulling at her arms. He had never seen her look so small. In the penthouse, she was a quiet force that kept his life moving. Out here on the sidewalk, she looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. He followed the bus across the city. He watched as the tall glass buildings he built began to disappear. The streets got narrower. The lights got dimmer. This was the part of town his company called the Outer Zone. On his office maps, this area was colored in red. It was a place that needed to be cleared away to make room for progress. He had signed the papers to start the demolition next month. Sarah got off the bus near a street that looked like it had been forgotten. David parked a block away and walked carefully behind her. He felt out of place. His expensive shoes felt too loud on the cracked pavement. He saw her turn toward a brick building that was leaning slightly to one side. It was an old community center. The paint was peeling, and the front door was held open by a heavy stone. She disappeared inside. David waited a moment, his heart beating a little faster. This was it. He was going to walk in and find his missing silver or his expensive wine, or whatever else she had been sneaking out. He pushed the door open and followed the sound of voices coming from below. He walked down a set of concrete stairs that led to the basement. He reached the bottom and stopped. The air didn't smell like a warehouse or a hidden stash of stolen goods. It smelled like garlic, onions, and slow-cooked meat. It smelled like a home. The room was full of people. There were old men sitting in folding chairs, young mothers holding tired children, and teenagers talking quietly in the corners. In the middle of it all was Sarah. She had her sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around her waist. She was standing at a large stove, stirring a massive pot with a wooden spoon. David watched as she opened the bags he had been so worried about. He didn't see silver or watches. He saw fresh bread. He saw cartons of milk. He saw vegetables and bags of rice. She wasn't stealing from him. She was using her own money he paid her, to buy food for people who had nothing. "Hey, Sarah, you got that special season today?" A young man called out. Sarah laughed. It was a sound David had rarely heard in his own home. "You know I do, Marcus. I wouldn't let you eat a bland meal." David stood in the shadows of the stairway, frozen. He looked at the faces in the room. Some of them looked familiar. Then it hit him. These weren't just random people. These were the people his company was pushing out. He was the one taking their homes. And Sarah was the only one making sure they had a meal. He wanted to turn and run, but he couldn't move. For the first time in his life, David Vane felt like he was the one who didn't belong. David didn't move. He stood there, tucked into the darkness of the stairwell, feeling like a ghost in a room full of life. He had spent his entire career looking at neighborhoods from the top floor of skyscrapers. From up there, people were just tiny dots, and buildings were just shapes on a map. But down here, the air was thick with the heat of the stove and the low hum of a dozen different conversations. He watched Sarah move through the room. It was like watching a completely different person. In his penthouse, she was quiet, almost invisible, moving like a shadow to keep his life perfect. Here, she was the sun. She didn't just serve food. She served hope. She touched an old man's shoulder and asked about his leg. She leaned down to whisper something to a little girl that made the child beam with pride. "Miss Sarah, did you get my message about the heat?" A young woman asked, walking over with a baby balanced on her hip. Sarah stopped stirring and took the woman's hands. "I did, Maya. I'm going to talk to the super tomorrow. Don't you worry. We'll get those blankets tonight, if we have to." David felt a cold chill run down his spine. He knew why Maya didn't have heat. He knew that building. It was one of the properties his company had bought 6 months ago. His managers had intentionally delayed repairs to encourage people to move out faster. It was a standard business tactic, minimizing maintenance costs on transitional assets. It sounded so clean in a boardroom. It looked so ugly in a basement. He watched Sarah pull a small, wrapped gift from one of her bags and hand it to a boy sitting nearby. "Happy birthday, Andre. 8 years old. You're getting so tall." The boy's face lit up, and for a second, David forgot he was a billionaire. He was just a man watching a woman do the work of a saint. Sarah knew these people. She didn't just know their names. She knew their stories. She knew who was sick, who was looking for work, and who was about to lose their roof. She was the glue holding these broken pieces together, and she was doing it with the crumbs he gave her as a salary. David looked at his hands. They were clean and soft. He thought about his spreadsheets, the ones where he calculated how much profit he could make by clearing the land. He realized that every time he moved a line on a graph, a person like Maya lost her heat. Every time he optimized a property, an old man like the one Sarah was talking to lost his peace. He had called them collateral damage. In his head, he had treated them like a math problem that needed to be balanced. But as he watched Sarah hug the crying mother, David realized there was no way to balance this. He wasn't just a developer. He was a destroyer. And the woman who had raised him was the only one trying to fix what he was breaking. He backed away slowly, his feet heavy on the concrete steps. He needed to get out before she saw him, not because he was angry, but because he was ashamed. The ride back to the penthouse was the longest of David's life. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't check his phone. He just sat in the silence of his luxury car, feeling the weight of that basement pressing against his chest. When he finally walked through his front door, the marble floors felt cold and the high ceilings felt empty. He didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the city lights, waiting for the sun to come up and for Sarah to arrive. At exactly 8 in the morning, the front door clicked. Sarah walked in, moving with her usual quiet grace. She looked tired. Her steps were a little slower than they had been 30 years ago, but her expression was the same calm mask she always wore. She headed straight for the kitchen to start his coffee. David didn't wait. He walked into the kitchen and stood by the counter. "Sarah," he said. She paused, a bag of coffee beans in her hand. She looked up, surprised to see him in the kitchen so early. "Good morning, David. You're up early. Would you like breakfast now?" "I followed you last night," David said. He didn't want to play games. He didn't want to lead up to it. He just needed the truth. Sarah went very still. She didn't drop the bag, but her fingers tightened around it. She didn't look away, either. She just stood there, searching his face with those wise, tired eyes. Finally, she set the coffee down and wiped her hands on her apron. "I see," she said softly. "I thought you were stealing," David admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I saw the bags every night. I thought you were taking things from the house. But I went to the basement. I saw the people. I saw what you were doing with the money I pay you." Sarah leaned against the counter. She didn't look ashamed. If anything, she looked relieved that the secret was out. "Those people have nothing, David. Your company. They bought the buildings. They cut the water. They raised the rent. Where did you think they went?" "I didn't think about it at all," David whispered. "But Sarah, it's not just soup. I saw you with those kids. I saw you handing out books. I saw people asking you for advice like you were a judge." Sarah took a deep breath. "For 30 years, David, I've been more than a housekeeper. When I leave here, I'm an organizer. I started a literacy program in that basement because the schools were failing. I started that food pantry because the grocery stores moved out when the revitalization started. While I was here making sure your bed was made and your house was gold, I was out there fighting a war to keep my neighbors alive." She looked him directly in the eye. "And the truth is, David, it's a war your company is winning. Every skyscraper you build is another block of history we lose. Every profit you make is another family I have to find a tent for." David felt like he had been struck. He had always seen himself as a builder, a man of progress. But to the woman who had raised him, he was the enemy. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw a hero who didn't need a uniform. She had spent her life saving people he hadn't even bothered to notice. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Sarah gave him a sad, small smile. "Because, David, you never asked." The kitchen felt smaller than it ever had. David stood by the marble island, his expensive suit feeling like a heavy, uncomfortable costume. He looked at Sarah's hands, worn, steady, and lined with a history of 2 lives. One life spent serving him, and another spent saving a world he was destroying. "You said I never asked," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm asking now. All those years, why did you keep going? Why that basement? Why those people?" Sarah pulled out a chair and sat down. She didn't wait for David to give her permission. The shift was subtle but powerful. The housekeeper was gone, and the woman was finally speaking. "I had a daughter once," she began. Her name was Naomi. David blinked. He had known Sarah for 34 years, and he had never heard that name. He didn't even know she'd had a child. "Naomi was a bright girl," Sarah said, a soft light flickering in her eyes for a split second before fading. She had a laugh that could fill a room. But when she was 7, she got sick. Not a sickness you catch from the air, but a sickness that comes when the body just doesn't have what it needs to fight. She looked at the high-end, professional-grade refrigerator in David's kitchen. It was a hunger-induced illness. Her immune system just collapsed because I couldn't get her the right nutrients. Back then, I was working 2 jobs. I was here during the day, making sure your nursery was perfect and your meals were organic. Then I'd go to second job cleaning offices until 3 in the morning. David felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Even with both jobs, the math didn't work, Sarah continued. The rent was rising. The local market had closed to make way for a parking lot. I could buy bread, but I couldn't afford the specialized care and the high-protein diet the doctors said she needed to get strong again. I was raising a billionaire son in a house of gold, but I couldn't afford to keep my own daughter alive in a house of wood. She paused, her voice steady but sharp. Naomi died in a cramped apartment 3 miles from this penthouse. She died because her mother was too busy making sure your life was beautiful to save hers. David felt the room tilt. He thought about his childhood, the expensive toys, the private tutors, the 5-course meals Sarah prepared for him while her own child was fading away just a few miles away. He realized that his entire life had been built on a sacrifice he never authorized and a debt he could never repay. After she passed, Sarah said, I promised I would never let another mother in my neighborhood stand over a small casket because they couldn't afford a bag of groceries. That basement isn't just a charity, David. It's Naomi's legacy. Every time I feed a child in that center, I'm talking to my daughter. I'm telling her that I'm finally doing what I should have been doing for her. David sank into the chair opposite her. For the first time in his life, the billionaire had no words. He looked at the woman who had loved him like a son and realized he had been the weight that held her down while her own world was drowning. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the hum of David's expensive appliances. The story of Naomi hung between them like a ghost. David looked at his hands, then at Sarah. He realized that saying, I'm sorry, would be like trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. It wasn't enough. I want to see it, David said, his voice cracking. Not from the shadows this time. I want to see what my work actually does. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and led him back out into the world. They didn't take his car. They walked. As they crossed the invisible line into the neighborhood David's company had acquired, the change was stark. Buildings were boarded up. Scaffolding covered half the street. High fences with the Vane development logo blocked off parks where children used to play. Sarah stopped in front of a small, cramped shelter. Sitting on a plastic chair near the entrance was a man with silver hair and skin that looked like worn leather. He was dressed in a clean, iron shirt, despite the heat. This is Elias, Sarah said. David stepped forward, feeling the urge to reach for his wallet, but Sarah's look stopped him. Money wasn't the currency here. Elias was a teacher for 40 years, Sarah explained. He owned a small apartment 3 blocks from here. He was the man everyone went to when they needed to understand a contract or write a letter to the city. Elias looked up at David. He didn't look angry. He looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. You're the Vane boy, Elias said. It wasn't a question. I am, David replied, feeling smaller than he ever had in a boardroom. I lived in my building for 4 decades, Elias said quietly. I raised my sons there. I buried my wife from that front door. I knew every crack in the sidewalk. I knew which neighbor needed help with their groceries on Tuesdays. He paused, looking at the construction crane towering over the next street, a Vane development crane. Then I got a letter. Elias continued. It said the building was being optimized. I had 60 days. My pension didn't cover the new market rate, rent. 60 days to pack up 40 years of life. Now, I sleep in a room with 12 other men. My books are in a dumpster somewhere. My history is gone. Elias didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just spoke the truth. David thought about the meeting where he had approved that specific project. He remembered his CFO talking about social extraction and unlocking value. They had toasted with champagne when the deal closed. Standing there, looking at Elias, David realized that unlocking value for him meant locking Elias out of his own life. His success wasn't built on innovation. It was built on taking things that didn't belong to him, history, dignity, and peace. He wasn't a developer. He was a thief who used a pen instead of a gun. I didn't know, David whispered. Elias looked at him with a gaze that cut through the billionaire's soul. That's the problem, son. You're the only one who had the power to know, and you're the only one who didn't bother to look. David walked away from Elias without looking back. He couldn't. Every step he took on the cracked pavement felt like he was walking on someone's chest. Sarah stayed behind to help Elias with his bags, leaving David to walk back to his world alone. When he reached his penthouse, the glass door slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. The air inside was perfectly filtered, the lights dimmed to a warm, inviting glow. But as David stood in the center of his massive living room, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt deafening. It felt like a vacuum, sucking the air right out his lungs. He walked over to his massive mahogany desk, where the blueprints for the Vane Spire were spread out. It was over the tallest building in the city, a shimmering needle of glass and steel that would bear his name in glowing lights at the top. Just yesterday, he had looked at these drawings and felt a surge of pride. Now, all he saw were the shadows underneath the lines. He traced the outline of the foundation. He realized that the concrete would be poured directly over the spot where Elias used to sit and watch the sunrise. The lobby would stand where Sarah's literacy program used to be. The luxury suites would float in the air where Naomi's life had been cut short because of a few $100s. Monuments, David whispered to the empty room. I'm just building monuments to myself on top of people's graves. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He felt sick. He looked at the expensive art on his walls, the custom-made furniture and the gold-plated fixtures. It all looked like trash. It was a hollow shell. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he realized he was the poorest man he knew. Sarah had nothing in her bank account, but she had a whole community that loved her. He had billions, and he was completely alone. He sat down at his computer. He didn't open his stock portfolio or check the market. Instead, he pulled up the confidential archives of Vane Development. He bypassed the profit projections and the tax shelters. He searched for the displacement logs, the files his lawyers usually kept buried. He stayed up all night. The blue light of the monitor reflected in his tired eyes as he read. He didn't look at the numbers this time. He looked at the names. The Miller family, the Santosas, the Wilsons. He read about a grandmother who had been moved to a shelter 3 towns away from her grandkids. He read about a small business owner who had lost his shop after 30 years and never reopened. He read about names that disappeared from the records entirely after they were served their notice. For the first time in his career, David wasn't calculating. He was mourning. He sat in the dark as the sun began to peek over the horizon, surrounded by the names of the people he had erased. He knew he couldn't go back to being the man he was yesterday. The Vane Spire was dead. The only question now was whether he was brave enough to tell the world why. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when David sent the email. It was a 1-sentence summons for an emergency board meeting at 9 a.m. He didn't shower or change out clothes he had worn all night. He simply grabbed a thick folder of names he had printed and headed to the Vane Development headquarters. The boardroom was filled with the city's most powerful investors. They sat in leather chairs, sipping expensive coffee, whispering about what kind of massive acquisition David was about to announce. They expected more growth. They expected more power. David stood at the head of the long table. He didn't use a projector. He didn't show a single graph. The Vane Spire is canceled, he said. The room went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. As of this morning, we are stopping construction. We are tearing up the plans. His CFO, a man named Marcus who had been with his father, stood up slowly. David, that's a $400 million loss. You're joking. I've never been more serious, David replied, his voice flat and steady. We aren't just stopping the Spire. We are changing everything. We are launching the Naomi initiative. From now on, Vane Development doesn't build luxury towers. We build community land trusts. We build permanent, affordable housing where the residents, people like Elias and Sarah, actually own a stake in the land. The room erupted. Investors were shouting about fiduciary duty, lawsuits, and madness. You're destroying the company, someone yelled. We'll have the board remove you by lunch. David waited for the noise to die down. He looked at them. At the first time, he didn't see partners. He saw the same blindness he had lived with for 36 years. You can try, David said, leaning over the table. But while you were sleeping, I called my attorneys. I've restructured my majority shares. I've moved 51% of my voting power into a new trust. That trust is controlled by a community advisory board. Sarah is the chair. Elias has a seat. If you want to build anything in this city, you have to answer to them now. The shock was so thick you could feel it. These were men and women who controlled billions, and David had just handed their leashes to a housekeeper and a displaced teacher. "This is suicide," Marcus whispered, leaning back into his chair. "No," David said, looking out the window at the skyline he had helped break. "It's a debt, and I'm finally starting to pay it back. We're going to build something that actually lasts. Not a building with my name on it, but a neighborhood where people can actually live." He walked out of the room before they could respond. He didn't care about the stock price or the lawsuits. For the first time in his life, David Vane felt like a man who could finally look himself in the mirror. David didn't go back to his office. He didn't go to celebrate. He went straight back to the penthouse, but he didn't use the private entrance. He walked through the front door like a guest. He found Sarah in the kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of soapy water. She was washing the breakfast dishes, just like she had for 3 decades. "Sarah," David said, leaning against the doorway. "Stop." She looked up, drying her hands on her apron. "The board meeting is over already?" That was fast. "Do you need lunch?" David walked over and took the towel from her hands. He sat on the counter and looked her in the eye. "I'm firing you," he said. Sarah froze. Her face didn't change, but her shoulders slumped just a little. "I see," she whispered. "I suppose I said too much this morning." "No," David said quickly, shaking his head. "You didn't say enough. I'm firing you as my housekeeper because that job is too small for you. You've been raising me and saving the city at the same time. It's over. You aren't going to make another cup of coffee for me as long as you live." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, printed document. "I've started the Naomi initiative. The board fought me, but it doesn't matter. I've given the community trust the power, and I want you to lead it. Your new title is Head of Community Equity. You're a partner now. Sarah, you're the one who tells me if a project is good enough for the people." Sarah looked at the paper, then back at David. For the first time, he saw her composure break. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look sad. She looked seen. "You really did it," she said. "We're doing it together," David replied. "I have the money and the tools, but I don't have a heart or the knowledge. I don't know how to talk to the neighbors. I don't know what a family needs to feel safe. You do. I need you to teach me how to be a person again." They didn't waste any time. Sarah didn't go back to cleaning, and David didn't go back to his blueprints. They sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. "Who do we call first?" David asked. "Elias," Sarah said without hesitation. "And then Maya, and then every family that had to move to the outskirts because they couldn't pay your rent. We aren't just giving them a place to stay, David. We're giving them the keys." The work was harder than anything David had ever done. It wasn't about signing a check. It was about sitting in small living rooms and listening to people who didn't trust him. It was about explaining that they weren't just coming back as renters. They were coming back as owners. They were going to have a say in the buildings, the parks, and the future of the streets. David watched Sarah lead. She didn't use big words or fancy promises. She just sat with people, held their hands, and told them the truth. She was no longer the woman in the background of his life. She was the light at the front of it. And for the first time in 36 years, David wasn't following a map. He was following a leader. 18 months later, the scaffolding was gone. The heavy gates with the Vane logo had been taken down and replaced by something David never thought he would build. Front doors that actually welcomed people. This was the first building of the Naomi initiative. It wasn't tall, and it didn't have a gold-plated lobby. Instead, it had wide porches where people could sit and talk, and communal gardens where the only thing being grown was enough food for everyone. David didn't arrive in a limousine today. He walked. He didn't stay on the top floor, either. There was no top floor, at least not one for him. He spent his day on the ground level, inside the new community clinic. It was a bright, clean space where mothers didn't have to worry about the cost of checkup. He saw a young mother walking out with a bag of fresh fruit and medicine, her face relaxed and peaceful. It was the kind of care Naomi should have had. By late afternoon, the smell of Sarah's cooking filled the courtyard. It was the same smell from the church basement, but this time it wasn't secret. David sat at a long wooden table next to Elias. The old teacher looked different. He wasn't sitting in a shelter anymore. He had his own apartment on the second floor, with a window that looked out over the street he had lived on for 40 years. "You did it, son," Elias said, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking at the kids playing in the garden. "You didn't just give us a roof. You gave us back our pride." Sarah sat down across from them, placing a large bowl of stew in the center of the table. She looked at David and smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a housekeeper. It was the smile of a partner. "We have a waiting list for the next building," she said. "People are coming home, David. Real home." David took a bite of the food. It was warm and rich. He looked around the table. He saw Maya laughing with her baby. He saw Marcus talking to a neighbor about the new job training program. For 36 years, David had lived in a world where he was the only person who mattered. He had built towers to hide in, thinking that power was the same thing as success. But as he sat there, sharing a meal on a porch in a neighborhood he used to ignore, he finally understood the math. He wasn't a billionaire anymore, at least not in the way he used to be. He had less money in the bank, but his life was finally full. He realized that home wasn't a fancy penthouse or a piece of property you owned. A home was a place where people knew your name. It was a place where you didn't have to hide who you were. It was a place where you were seen. David Vane looked at Sarah and Elias, and for the first time in his life, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. The story of David and Sarah teaches us that true success isn't measured by the height of the towers we build, but by the depth of the foundations we lay for others. David was a man of numbers, yet he failed to calculate the most important variable, human dignity. We often go through life looking at people, our neighbors, our co-workers, even those who serve us, without ever truly seeing them. Sarah spent over 20 years in the background, but she was the only one truly building a future. The big question: if you discovered that your greatest success was built on someone else's greatest loss, would you have the courage to tear it all down and start over? And there you have it, my loves. David learned that home isn't a penthouse. It's the place where you are finally seen and known. Sarah taught us that one person's quiet courage can change the skyline of an entire city. I hope this story touched your heart as much as it did mine. Don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be there reading every single one. Until next time, stay kind and keep being a blessing to someone's story. Love you, Bestie.